Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my webinar devoted to maritime cultural heritage in maritime spatial planning. I'm Magdalena Matczak, working in the Maritime Institute of the Maritime University in Gdynia. Maritime spatial planning practitioners for over 10 years. I'm not a cultural expert. I'm not an expert in maritime cultural heritage management, but I have spent some years working in projects that were dealing with such a challenging topic, how to include the cultural values, cultural heritage in the new process of maritime spatial planning. It will be, I think, a little bit different webinar than the rest of the webinars you have watched so far, because it will be more a kind of emotional discussion. I will, of course, show you some specific information, but the cultural topic, the cultural heritage topic, it's very emotional. It's also emotional to me because it's interesting and it gives something important to the planning process. I will base my presentation in most of the time on the findings or activities of the Baltic Rim project. You have the address to the project on the screen, and that is the project that was finished last year in 2020 and was devoted especially to the Baltic Sea region cultural heritage and how to integrate it into the maritime spatial planning. We will talk about the definitions, of course, at the beginning. What does it mean to us, to society, the cultural heritage? We will talk a little bit about the Baltic potential, what is interesting there, what we can find there under the water and also at our coasts. Then we will talk about the threats and synergies, because this is what is important to the planners and what is the role of maritime spatial planning and what are the challenges. I'm always repeating for the planners, we have some very specific needs. We have to have a great knowledge of the topics we will decide upon. So we should know what is the current state of this specific sector. I'm talking now about the cultural heritage as a sector, not as a resource, because some of the scientists or some of the managers, they are treating the cultural heritage as one of the resource, like similarly to the natural resources that we have to protect it. But I like to think about the cultural heritage as about the sector, as about the very important player in a maritime spatial planning that has its interests. And it can also be used for the benefits of economic growth because there are some synergies. So we have to know the current state. Where do we have those resources? What is the importance, value of those objects or of the area of the places? Where is it specifically? You have to remember the maritime spatial planning is not only about the values, but the most important is where they are located. And of course, what are the threats and synergies? All of this knowledge raises awareness of planners. This is the crucial thing, that the planners have to be aware about the importance of the topic, importance of the cultural heritage. Otherwise, they won't be able to incorporate it in a proper way in their process. I'm always repeating that if you don't have the cultural heritage in your heart, you will not put it into the process, because this is not a very strong player. It's just a culture. So when you compare with the other sectors like marine energy production or shipping or fishery, it's not that important. But when you have it in your heart, when you have this knowledge, and when you are aware, you will always remember about this. And it's also about the stakeholder awareness. So it's not only about teaching planners, but it's also to teach other stakeholders like fishermen, like offshore wind farms investors, about the cultural heritage. At the beginning, let's talk about what is it, what does it mean to us, and why it's so important. So the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, as you can see, it deals only with underwater cultural heritage. And this is the concept which was used a few years ago when the maritime spatial planning process was developed. We were talking about the underwater cultural heritage, but for the years and years and years since that time, the concept developed, and I will show you in a next slide how complicated it became. But let's start from the convention. So we have here definition. What is underwater cultural heritage? What should it mean to us? So it means all traces of human existence having a cultural, historical or archaeological character. And what is very important here we have a time frame that they have been underwater periodically or continuously for at least 100 years. So it means that if we have, for example, some remains from the Second World War, they are not a underwater cultural heritage in the meaning of the convention, because they are underwater less than 100 years. The time flows by, so they will reach the 100 years in one moment. So let's see what elements can be protected. So site, structures, buildings, artifacts, human remains, vessels, aircrafts, even other vehicles or parts of the vehicles like cargo. So if we have a barrel that is left somewhere, not in a ship, but somewhere outside of the ship, it's also underwater cultural heritage if it has this cultural, historical or archaeological character to us. Objects of prehistoric characters, which is quite important. Such installations like pipelines and cables, they will never be considered as underwater cultural heritage, which I'm very glad of. Also, the installations other than pipelines and cables, which are quite old but are still in use, shall not be considered as underwater cultural heritage. The convention also defines as some kind of activities. What does it mean, activities directed at underwater cultural heritage? Which is quite important, in my opinion, is the number 7, activities affecting underwater cultural heritage. And that means all the activities which may physically disturb or otherwise damage underwater cultural heritage. So those are those threats which we have to identify to protect the heritage within the maritime special planning also. So looking at the Baltic Rim website, we have also there some definitions about those material heritage like archaeological sites. And here you can see that we are not talking only about the underwater. We left the sea and we came to the land, to the coastal zone, and then we look more wider at the concept of cultural heritage. So we have archaeological sites. Also, those are all about the material remains, which allows the study of human activity. So this is very important, that the cultural heritage always is connected with the humans' activities. Were they in Stone Age or 100 years ago, they have to be connected to the human activities. So we have different definitions depending on what we are talking about. We can talk about the monument, we can talk about the coastal and maritime cultural heritage, and so on, so on. But this part of cultural heritage is called tangible material heritage. So they are elements, they are buildings, ships, boats, or something like that. Is that this tangible material heritage enough? I mean, that's quite easy because we can map it. We can make a map of the wrecks, we can make a map of sunken harbors, ships, or even the paleo landscapes. But is it enough to catch this cultural heritage concept? Here we start to dig into more interesting but more challenging topics. What about the perception? What about the emotions? What about society perception towards the sea? I will show you now the results of the discussion with the students I have performed for the last 2 years. I asked them, what does it mean for you, the maritime cultural heritage? So they were writing to me some words. Yes, what does it mean for them? So we can see the sunken ships, but the history of technical evolution, this is something not tangible, not material. We have building fortifications, but we also have sources of information. We have port infrastructure, but we also have songs, shanties, liquors, food and kitchen, all connected with the maritime culture. We have treasures, we have underwater caves, lighthouses, herring, fossils, villages, anthropology. We have fishing nets, okay? We have sometimes smells of the fish. We have sunken cities, bathing sites. At the end, they all came to result to the sentence, to the feeling that such a cultural heritage is our capital for the future. So this is something that we would like to left for our children to remember those historical times. So you can see that except the tangible cultural heritage, we have this emotional, intangible, immaterial components which are challenging and difficult to map. So with this intangible concept, the cultural significant areas stay in line. This is a new idea, a new concept developed within the last few years, and it means the areas which are considered culturally significant by communities. So here you don't talk to the archaeologists, you don't talk to managers, yes, you don't talk to the people in ministry, what they have in their registers, but here you talk just to people, and you talk to them asking questions, and then you can perform a research where are those culturally significant areas. And in this concept, it was developed mainly so far in the North Sea region by my colleague Kira G. In this concept, you work with the areas based on 5 criteria, and here you have those 5 criteria, how to find those areas important for society. So, for example, uniqueness is very important, that such an area is unique within the region. So is it unique? Is it something that is so important here? Or maybe it's all over the world, or maybe it's only here, for example, in our Baltic Sea region. Broad community reliance. So how many people does recognize this area? Importance to resilience. How essential is the area or feature to the cultural integrity of the community? What would happen if this area or this feature would be lost? Will it be a huge problem for the society, or nobody will react to that? Nobody will notice this. So degree of tradition and dramatic cultural change. So does this unique context of the culture that values the feature give it special importance? Those are the criteria that help us to find those culturally significant areas. If you are interested in this concept, you can visit the paper issued by Raji with other colleagues in 2017, Identify Cultural Significant Areas for Maritime Spatial Planning. And here you have this concept more deeply recognized, discussed, and some baselines are described and some primary results are described also. Of course, you can ask, why are we talking about this intangible, immaterial heritage? This idea try to support maritime spatial planning with this community perception, but also giving it a special location. So they make the cultural values specially explicit, enabling them to be considered in decision making. So you know where are those important areas to the people. You can then try to keep them in your mind when thinking about decisions of the space. So looking also at the other concept of the intangible immaterial heritage, we have, for example, the intangible cultural heritage, which is a tradition to use the ancient practice in nowadays. So like you have here the pictures, those are the traditional boats building, like the Viking boats, which are built now in the same manner like hundreds of years ago. Or you have these historical ship races in the Baltic Sea performed quite often when you have a lot of historical ships on the water. So this is also a kind of intangible cultural heritage when you take the practice from the old years and perform it in the same way now. There's another concept of underwater landscape, and this is a mixture of everything. So this is a mixture of the natural values. As you can see here on the screen, there's a mixture of the elements of the bottom, the light reflected from the surface, of course, connected with the traces of human life and maritime cultural heritage, and with the kind of sediments, with the pieces of biota and so on. So the underwater cultural heritage is everything what you find under the surface of the water, and which we can use it to feel more emotions and to visit and feel better. This is the underwater landscape concept, and this is not just a theory or scientific concept. This is the concept which is used, for example, in Finland by the culture managers, and this is the concept which is also used in the planning process. So the areas which are very interesting from the landscape point of view, so the light, as you see, is interesting. There are some remains, and the bottom is interesting. They are mapping such areas which are bigger than just a wreck, and they are calling them the underwater landscape area, and there are some protected measures put in this place. So As you can see, there is a lot of examples and a lot of different concepts about maritime cultural heritage. This is not everything. I told you about those the most important, or about those which I like the most. But of course, you have a lot of other concepts like land-sea interactions. When you look at the interactions between the sea and the coast, you have the perception of the fishing villages from the sea, and so on and so on. But looking at some examples, you can see here the example from the Estonian Maritime Special Plan. They have performed some kind of spatial analysis before they start the planning process, and they defined the social cultural values in Estonia. So you can see here such a maps showing the local maritime infrastructure, recreational services, water sports area, cultural heritage coast, so the coasts which are quite important from the cultural heritage point of view, and the sea area of cultural values. So they have found that this area is very important from the cultural point of view, also taking into consideration the recreational, so touristic values. So you can see that those concepts vary also between the countries. It also depends on the data you have, what questions you have asked people when you were talking to them. So it's quite complicated and challenging. So when you look at the other examples of the cultural heritage, you can see here the examples from the Polish coast, so the city of Gdańsk, Jastarnia, Gdańsk Bay, and so on, so on. Everything you can treat as a culture when you feel emotionally attached to this. If there's something you want to be protected, sustained, and you don't want to harm this is something that is valuable for you. You can look at the modern world, at the plans of the huge container ports to be built offshore, and you can ask, is it a maritime cultural landscape? Is such a view from Gdynia to Gdańsk, looking at the CT port in Gdańsk, is it maritime cultural heritage? For some of us, not, because it's something that spoils the landscape, but maybe some of us can be inspired and creates a nice picture out of this. So then for this person, this is a cultural heritage also. You never know what will be the cultural heritage for our children. We know about the tangible heritage, about the intangible heritage, about the culturally significant areas, and I want to show you now the example of something very also different, about the emotional mapping. This is the exercise which have been performed within the Pan-Baltic Scope project in Finland and in Åland archipelago. They have performed a mapping of emotionally meaningful areas. So they have created a special application just for the citizens of those regions and have asked them some questions, like, for example, areas where they have found memories with their families, areas where they can relax and enjoy with natural values, or areas where they responded has a strong connection to the environment itself. So such a exercise have been done, such a research have been done, and the people, they mark the places they perceive as emotionally valuable. You see here the results of such a mapping. So it's quite interesting because it shows that some areas are very emotionally significant to most of the respondents. Of course, then there is a question what to do with this knowledge. Should we, for example, not to be a port there because it's very important for the society, culturally important. I don't know whether there is such a connection between this knowledge and such a decision, but still it's good to know those emotions, those areas, because you can also be aware of the potential conflicts between the society and new developments. It's also quite important. Here is another example of such a maps, like the naturally meaningful and culturally meaningful areas. You can see here culture and nature areas in this Åland archipelago. So I think this is quite interesting idea. And if you want to be a planner and if you want to use this concept in your future work, it's quite easy tool. Of course, it's challenging because you have to go to the people and ask them. But it's quite challenging also for people because it makes you think where you have those emotions and why do you feel some places are more important to you. So we know what is the cultural heritage, more or less, of course. We know what does it mean to us, and I think we know why it's so important. If you still don't know why it's so important, we can look at the final report of the Baltic Rim project, the Integrated Cultural Heritage into Maritime Spatial Planning, the final publication. It's available at the website, and we can see a kind of summary why it's so important. When people feel connected to the land, they're happier, yes. They work better, you can say. So the maritime cultural heritage connects people and generations. I think it's quite important, and even now in the pandemic time, we can feel it, that without those relations, without going to the cultural places, we somehow are losing those connections and relations. What is also important here in this summary is that we have to be also aware that those cultural values are sometimes non-renewable. They are very fragile. If there is any harm is done to them, they cannot be sometimes replaced. So we really have to be very careful with those features. We know what it is, why it's important. Let's look now specifically into the cultural heritage in the Baltic Sea region. You have to be aware that in the Baltic Sea region, we have such a committee which is called Baltic Region Heritage Committee. This cooperation lasts since 1998. And there are 3 working groups which are devoted to maritime cultural heritage. This is the Underwater Heritage Working Group, the Coastal Heritage Working Group, and 20th Century Built Cultural Heritage Group. This group is interesting. They have produced good reports, and this is a good source of knowledge also for the planning process, because some of the reports are spatially oriented. So it's not only about describing the values, but also showing where those values are located. Still, you have to be aware that they are focused on this tangible cultural heritage. When looking at one of the reports from 2006, it's called the Rutilus report, and it's quite important because that was the first pan-Baltic map with the 10 of the most important cultural places when talking about the cultural heritage. So it's like the most hot 100 places which are very important for each of the countries for the Baltic Sea cultural heritage. So when you look about the distribution of the different types, so most of them from those 100, it goes to wrecks. Then we have settlements. They are sunken on their coastal settlements. It's different. Then we have harbors, which are also traditional, or some of them, they are just underwater, so they are sunken. We have also the battle areas. 3 of them are marked in this report as very important battle areas. And we also have fishing structures and some defense structures. So you can see from this map, from this graph, that the most important with regards to cultural heritage are wrecks. Maybe they are not the most important, but they are the most important in numbers. As you saw from the Rutilus list, we have there some categories, but the Baltic Rim project also tried to look at the types of Baltic maritime cultural heritage and try to find the common definitions between the countries. Because when we look at the material cultural heritage and the national registers, so those archaeological registers, historical registers of the places and items that are under protection, then each of the Baltic countries, they have a little bit different definitions, a little bit different elements they protect. This is also connected to the different history of the countries, of course, but we try to find a common categories between those countries. We try to find where there are some categories that are unique for all the Baltic countries. So you can see here the results of such an analysis of national registers. The analysis of the registers have been performed together with the experts' view, and they show some commonalities between the countries. So we have like 4 categories which are always in the national register. So we have wrecks. Most of the Baltic Rim partners have wreck in their registers. We have a burial sites. We have stone on wood structures or foundations, remainings of the hydrotechnical structures. And we have the fortifications also. Of course, there are other types in commons, like those related to the First and Second World War, but they are not always treated as a cultural heritage in all of the countries. Let's see now, I will show you some maps and some facts about those categories. So let's look at the wrecks. Wrecks constitute so far the most numerous category of the underwater cultural heritage, but it does not mean that they are the most valuable. They are just the most numerous, and it's not always goes in line with the value. Of course, there is a great variety of wrecks origin. You can see here like the timeline of the history of the Baltic Sea and the different eras and different conquests. And also those types of boats depends on where such activities have been taking place. When you look at the Rutilus 100 list wrecks, you also have a graph of the origin of those wrecks. So you can see that the biggest number are the wrecks quite new, coming from the 20th century, but then the biggest numbers are those from the 18th century and the 19th century, as well as the 16th and 17th century. So all of those historical eras of the huge wars for hegemony between the different nations in the Baltic Sea region, those are the huge ships sunken, for example, in the waters of Finnish Bay. They are coming from those years. And of course, for the purposes of the special planning, for the maritime special planning, the most important is the knowledge of the location and the potential protection needs. Of course, you have to remember that maritime special planning is not a tool for everything. We cannot substitute the proper management of those values. There are different policies that apply. You have the convention, for example, the UNESCO Convention, which gives some responsibilities to the countries to protect the cultural heritage, but maritime special planning can support somehow, like how to avoid the threatening uses and on the places where such values are. So we have to know where those wrecks are located. How does it look in the different countries? Here you have the maps from reports which all of the Baltic countries prepared for the maritime special planning purposes. So we have prepared so-called state-of-the-art what's going on in our waters. I have to say that all of the countries in the Baltic Sea region, they have taken the underwater cultural heritage into the consideration in their reports, which means they have used this very early concept of underwater tangible material heritage, which is protected, which the data is stored in the national register. Only few countries touch this intangible other values, but this is quite a challenging and difficult topic, and I think it can be used in next round of maritime special planning, and maybe you will work on that. So remember about this intangible concept also. Looking at Sweden, you have here the map of Swedish known vessel remains on Swedish waters. So you can see that there is a plenty of them, and this is a kind of point information, but it's also kind of information per 100 square kilometers. So it's not only a point, but it's a kind of average number of ships on an area of 100 kilometers. So it's a kind of average value. The same way of showing the wrecks have been applied in Finland. You can see here the underwater cultural objects density, and it's also on the 100 kilometer square area. Then we can go to Estonia and Latvia. So you can see here a different approach of mapping the singular objects. Yes, so it's not a density. This is just a mapping of cultural monuments which are in national registers, the same in Latvia. Although you can see here in Latvia also they have marked the coastal areas. You have here lighthouses and historical fishermen villages or cities. So more of the cultural values are marked in this map. Then if we go to Lithuania and Poland, we can see the same approach, so marking the possible location of wrecks, and in Polish case also the underwater cultural heritage, so we just put the dots where the shipwrecks are, but we didn't do any density analysis here because we were not aware of such a concept so far. So when we put all of this information on one map, we have performed such a map within the Baltic Sea region, trying to to put the same methodology of calculating to all the countries. So we have calculated the wreck density, number per 100 square kilometers. So you can see here a unified map for most of the Baltic Sea region countries, not all of them, because for the moment of this map creation, we didn't have all of the information, but you can see that where the biggest density of wrecks are. So of course on these Finnish waters and the Danish Straits, when the entrance to the Baltic Sea region is and was historical also, and when some huge battles have been performed also. When talking about the underwater cultural heritage in the Baltic Sea region are remainings of paleolandscapes. So it all goes back to the geology of the Baltic Sea, which suggests that at the Baltic bottom can be found some preserved archaeological sites even from the early beginnings of the Holocene. There is a lot of findings, especially in this part of southern Baltic. You can see here Denmark, Germany, southern Sweden, Polish coast, and also Lithuania, because those lands are submerged now, but years, ages, or thousands or 10,000 years ago, we had a land here with a forest. You can see here remainings of the old pine trunk, which was found close to the Polish coast, of course, submerged now. And this is one of the proof that the coastline was in a different place. Of course, we have submerged port structures and the sea battles, and those port structures, they also goes back. The reason why they are submerged now is because of the movements of land, so submersion of the southern Baltic because of some geological processes. And also we have the sea battle places. I have told you earlier that we had a huge 3 sea battles. Those were performed in the north part of the Baltic Sea, in the Gulf of Finland, 2 of them, and near the Ålands Islands. Those were very huge battles, and the shipwrecks are there, and they are quite important also from the point of view of protection. Is the Pan-Baltic picture possible? So if you put all of those categories, features all together, you can have such a maps. Of course, you can discuss whether this map is useful because of the scale or of the accuracy of the data which have been used, but still this is something that gives you a picture, and then you can have a feeling that you can look at these Baltic regions from different perspectives. So you have to remember that the coastal waters, it doesn't matter whether you are here or in the northern part or in the Finnish Bay or in the Botnian Bay, the coastal waters are kingdom of maritime cultural heritage. So you have to be aware that when you are planning something in a coastal zone, in those close areas to the land, you have to pay respect to those maritime cultural heritage while planning human activities, because the probability that there is something in the bottom is very, very, very high. So you have to be aware about that, and you have to put some protective measures when you are planning your waters. You have to be aware also about that these sandy bottoms of the southern Baltic can hide interesting history, which goes back to the Paleolithic times. You have to also keep it in mind when you are planning your investments. And what is most important from the project is that the joint efforts, that there are some potential transnational areas with the same common conditions and common problems, like between the Lithuania, Russia, and Poland. We have this issue of potential settlements from the Paleo times, from the Stone Age times. So probably some common research could be done here, and the common work on the planning solutions could be done. So we know about the current state, we know what is located, we know about the importance, about the value, but what about the threats? What is so threatening to this maritime cultural heritage, and are there any synergies? So again, we have this map of the potential Baltic, and then let's see at some threatening. Because the cultural values or those elements are located at the sea bottom, we have to be aware that everything that disturbs the bottom structure is a threat to the underwater cultural heritage. For example, here at the first slide showing the scenarios of the development of different Baltic sectors, like the development of shipping, which means that we will have more traffic, we will have a bigger ship. But it means that some of the, for example, waterways have to be deepened, they have to be dragged. And this is something that can be threatening to the cultural heritage, to those wrecks or to the remainings. Here on the maps, you can see see the potential, the directions of the shipping development in the Baltic Sea region. So you can see that the shipping will be performed strongly in the Bay of Finnish Bay, and there will be a bigger traffic to the Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian and Estonian ports. So probably the shipping will be more intensified there and the threats will be bigger there. You also see here with those orange dots the ports which have plans to be developed offshore. They will use the sea space, they will use the bottom, there will be huge investments touching the bottom. And this is quite challenging for cultural heritage because our new ports, very often they are built on those historical ports. And I will show you in a few minutes the example of the Gdańsk port, where such a conflict between the underwater cultural heritage and port development is existing. There we have a linear infrastructure. Here you have a map also of the scenarios of development of cables, which will be transmitting in the future the energy produced in offshore wind farms. So here you have those dots, those are the potential wind farms, and then the linear connections, which are the energy transmissions, which are transferring the energy to the lands. They are also threats to the cultural heritage. Then very important threat, fishery, especially the bottom trawling, which use the nets that are trawled on the bottom. And you can see that all of the southern Baltic is under threat to that. And then dredging, so this is what is connected to the shipping lines, to the new ports, to all of the investment that needs to deepen the sea bottom. So this is everything you have to be aware that such a threat exists. I want to show you one more threat to the cultural heritage. Does not depend on a human, but which is a very huge threat to the wooden cultural heritage. So it means to most of the wrecks which are in the Baltic Sea region. A shipworm, it's not really a worm, it's a bivalve, it's a clumps. But this is an animal that is very fastly consuming wood. It creates a huge threat to the wooden structures. They are known also from the history, and they were also the reason why the old ships in the old times, they start to be protected with the copper and other substances on materials, because sometimes those ships have been just full of holes after one trip to the battlefield. Why I'm talking about this shipworm? Because it has some special conditions which allows him to grow and to live in a water environment. Fortunately, the conditions in the Baltic Sea region are not very good for this shipworm, so it is not very widely distributed in the Baltic Sea region. That's why it is said that the water cultural heritage is very well preserved in the Baltic Sea region, because we don't have too many of the shipworm in the Baltic Sea environment, so they are kind of naturally protected from this animal. Still, if you look at this map and when you take into consideration there was a project which modeled the changes of occurrence of the shipworm, which depends on the climate change. So they have modeled the changes in the salinity, and they also have modeled the changes in water temperatures. And it showed, unfortunately, that this occurrence of the shipworm, there will be more of them in the Baltic Sea waters with the climate changes, so with the rising of temperatures, with the rising of salinity. This natural enemy of the cultural heritage will also in one moment appeared in the whole Baltic Sea region. Okay, we are talking about the threats. Maritime spatial planning is very much about threats and conflict solving, but we also have to look a little bit into the synergies. Here is a very short example of synergy between the maritime cultural heritage and tourism. So it's Gustav Adolf Underwater Park, located in Finnish Bay, 3.5 miles from Helsinki. This is the Swedish Armada, which was sunk during the Swedish-Russian War, and it's very well preserved. No shipworm, remember, not far from the coast, not very deep. It's the maximum depth is 21 meters, and this park is quite new. I mean, it was opened 20 years ago, but it's still a new concept, and you can just go there by yourself. Of course, you will get a guide, and you can go from one point to another. As you can see, all the points are marked, and there are some descriptions underwater, what you can see, what is there, what is the history of this place, and you can go by yourself diving all over the Gustav Adolf wreck and visit presented in such a way this very nice place. So this is a kind of synergy between the tourism and maritime cultural heritage. We know a lot, and now I want to show you some examples and challenges. Of course, I will focus on Polish examples. That's my land. So I will show you how we try to approach this concept, what information we have gathered for the Polish planning process, which have been taking place in the last few years. First, we have mapped all these points, as you know, so we didn't use the concept of the underwater landscape or the intangible cultural values because we were not aware. So we have mapped all the wrecks of historical values which were in a Polish register. What we have done also, we have placed the geological maps on top of this, and we looked where is the old coastline from the Stone Age years. So you can see that here everything was land a few thousand years ago. So we could imagine we had this awareness that this area, there is a high potential of the paleo landscapes in this area. So solutions such as wordings are placed in Polish Maritime Special Plan that in these areas there is a high probability of paleo remainings and some protected measures have to be applied when performing some investments. When we look at the Gdańsk port, here you have the old historical maps of the Gdańsk port, and here we have, you can see the old entrance to the port, which is nowadays in a different place. But when we put it all together, the new coastline and the old coastline, you can see that those wrecks are connected with this old entrance to the port of Gdańsk. So they were waiting for entering to the port of Gdańsk, and something happened and they sank down. Also here we have a lot of wrecks of historical value, and the problem now is that we also have here a huge plans for the development of the offshore ports of Gdańsk. So here is a huge discussion now how to cope, how to protect those cultural values, how to sustain them, because as I said, they are not renewable. You cannot just take them out of the water and place in some building. So you can see there are challenges different from the scale. And I want to show you also a map which have been prepared last year. As you can see here, different features, okay? You can see here that the density have been calculated of the, so we can see the areas where the density of wrecks and the submerged structures are the biggest. We can see here the lighthouses with the visual aspects of visual protection areas. So we can like try in the maritime special planning to protect the landscapes, the visual aspects of those historical lighthouses. We also have here in the Puck Bay the paleo landscapes incorporated into the map. So this is like a new map of the cultural values of the Gulf of Gdańsk. Of course, they are all the time material and tangible. We should also put here, if we would like, the map of the intangible values. But so far, such a map does not exist for the Gdańsk Bay. Coming to the end with my presentation, but still I want to show you some recommendations developed by the Baltic Rim project, how to integrate maritime cultural heritage into maritime special planning. You can find those recommendations in final reports, so I very much advise you to look into those books. I will just show you those recommendations, which in my opinion, I think they are the most important. So the first recommendation, how to integrate, what to do to treat the cultural heritage properly in maritime special planning. Easy task, recognize the richness and diversity. Okay, so this is what I showed you earlier. We have to just create a database. Look at what we have in our databases, try to find, maybe hire experts and so on, try to gather the knowledge. Without the knowledge, we cannot recognize the richness. So this is very important. The next recommendation, which is very, very important in my opinion, recognize that many phenomena such as lighthouses, shipyards, shipwrecks manifest the history of current maritime activities and sectors. And the maritime special plans should not affect negatively the accessibility, visibility, and possibility to create identity to a given place. So we should try to plan our water areas in such a way that those aspects are visible. Yes, we do not harm them. This is also what I mentioned at the beginning, ensure that maritime cultural heritage is mentioned as one of many marine activities, uses and interests as a sector. You give it more importance when you treat it as a sector, in my opinion. And it's also suggested by the European Directive on Maritime Spatial Planning. Integrate cultural heritage located both at land and at sea. Give a holistic pictures. Look wide and try to take it as it is. Ensure that when you are planning, when you are performing the Maritime Spatial Plan, when you are taking part in the process as a planner, that the national authority responsible for cultural heritage and other stakeholders are recognized. Do not forget about them. Yes, invite them to the process, engage them in the process, ask them questions, ask them for data, ask them for opinion from the very beginning. Another recommendation is that you should verify the needs of protection of such an element, because it's not always that they need a real protection. Sometimes you just have to have the knowledge about them. This is also what I have told you. Be aware of the areas of high potential. So the coastal water, the kingdom of maritime cultural heritage. If you are planning coastal water, just remember about the cultural heritage there. This is the problem with the cultural heritage, because maritime spatial planning is much about zoning. You are creating a zones, like a zone for shipping, zone for offshore wind energy. But because of the small scale of those elements, sometimes you have one reg, sometimes there is 5 regs, but this is still a small scale. You should consider using not zones but rules for maritime cultural heritage. So you just have to create some kind of general statements in your plan that protect or show the cultural heritage and how to incorporate it in a maritime spatial plan. One of the last but very important recommendation, at least for me, is that you should extend the list of maritime cultural heritage categories. As you see from these presentations, there are a lot of new concepts, but still when you are looking at the planning evidence, there are some routine categories: wrecks, lighthouses, parallel landscapes, yes, the harbors and so on. But you should test new categories. Rethink the existing one. Think about them in a different way. So you have to be open to the new concepts. Another one, identify planning options which increase the possibility that maritime cultural heritage is covered in cross-sector, cross-border and land-sea aspects. Promote the multi-use concept. This is very important because then you give more options how the maritime cultural heritage is seen. Not only as something that hamper your investment, but it can be seen also as a challenge, as an option, even as an economic option, that we can use it for the blue growth. Understand the importance. So this is what I said at the beginning. Have it in mind. Have it in your heart, even if it's not possible to integrate it in a maritime spatial plan, in your maritime spatial plan. Not always it's possible. Just understand the importance, understand the rules, the concept. Just let it be the planning precondition. Even if you don't put any planning solutions regarding the maritime cultural heritage, just have it as a planning precondition. For the very end, one of the most important recommendations, and this is recommendation to you as the first round of the maritime spatial planning is over in the Baltic region. Most of the countries have adopted the maritime spatial plans, but there will be a second round. Let's not forget about this. The planning process is a cycle. It's not the end. We have to now monitor how the plans will be adopted. We have to monitor how they are changed. So we also have to include the cultural heritage elements into the monitoring, and we have to be prepared for the next round of maritime spatial planning. So we should now think how to expand our knowledge. So we now should perform those analysis of intangible cultural values. Why not? So we are prepared for the next round of the maritime spatial planning. Ladies and gentlemen, let the maritime cultural heritage conquer your heart and stay there forever. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a nice day and I hope it was quite interesting. Thank you very much.